Welcome to the Elevating Voices in Leadership podcast, brought to you in partnership with Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Education. I am Dr. Gabriela Miramontes, and I will be your host. With me today are my co-hosts, Dr. Maria Brame, Dr. Asia Ghazi, Dr. Sonia Sharifi-Fard, Ms. Sharletta Green, Ms. Aida Jafari, and Ms. Willen Schneider.
So good afternoon, my friends. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. So we are in voter season craziness, and I thought it would be a good idea for us to talk about why voting is so contentious and yet why it's so important. So what we know right now is voting is a big issue, not just in the United States, but around the globe. And we're kind of watching that. We're watching what's going on in Brazil with their election. And we're watching, what's going on in some of the Middle Eastern countries. And you're like, okay, so why is voting so contentious? Well, for us here in the United States, voting is a right that's been anchored and guaranteed by the Constitution. And it's been a right that groups have had to fight for at different junctures. And so African-American men who were once enslaved could not vote until the 15th Amendment went in. But the 13th and 14th Amendment had to come first. So end of slavery, codifying them as citizens, and then giving them the right to vote. But women still didn't have the right to vote, right? Women don't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, and then Black women, Indigenous women, they don't have that right, really. There are all kinds of rules and regulations around how they don't get to vote. So it's not until 1965 that all people in the United States have the right to vote. That's not that long ago, my friends. It's not that long. And there's this constant struggle in the country. Is voting our right as citizens, or is it a privilege? Right? That's the rub in the conversation and the struggle. And so as I've been kind of paying attention to what's going on around the country, and why there's such a struggle, if voting wasn't so important, we wouldn't be fighting like this. And so what I've been watching is what's on the docket, really. What's on the ballot? What's the struggle? What are people fighting for? And there's an image of the United States that some people hold that's not anchored in reality. It's, a one group of people, it's their land, it's their whatever. And it's like, well, don't know that that's true. And that everything should then be based on this. But as we begin looking at what's going on, we realize that this one way of thinking silences all kinds of voices and sets people in these crazy spaces. So one of the things that I wanted to look at was, what are our demographics and what do the demographics say? So this is one of the challenges that is causing voting to be such a big mess and very contentious. We often hear Dr. Gabby talk about her daughter. Her daughter's generation is the most diverse generation, and it's the first generation that is Black and brown dominant. Like, by the time they get to 18, the United States will not look like what we've been used to it looking like. And the question becomes, do we want them growing up in a world where the color of their skin, who they love, where they live, and how much money they have, all takes them out of the running from having a voice, from having representation, and for being seen and cared for as human beings and citizens? So this is what's really on the ballot right now. So I've been looking at different things. Some of the first things that I didn't pay attention to but needed to is the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013. Do you all know that? So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. So let's start by telling you what the 15th Amendment says, telling you what the Voting Rights Act did, and then what happened in 2013 and how it's landed us here today. So the 15th Amendment tells us that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So that's the 14th Amendment. When we get to 1965, which is the Voting Rights Act, which offers all people now, not just white men, not just Black men, not just white women, but all people, this right to vote. It puts in two important pieces that I didn't know. So the first one is when you're looking at what the Civil Rights Act, well, the Voting Rights Act does, is it takes into account that there are places that have limited people's ability to vote based on color. And they've used all kinds of tactics in order to keep them from voting. And so right after Obama's second election, the Supreme Court in 2013, in the case Shelby Counter versus Holder, in a 5-4 vote, struck down the formula at the heart of the Voting Rights Act that required certain states and localities with a history of discriminating against minority voters to get changes cleared by the federal government before they went into effect. And so right after that, Texas and North Carolina covered by this law at first. Now, then they enacted new voter ID laws and other restrictions. Now, North Carolina's didn't stay, but Texas did. Mississippi and Alabama have photo ID requirements now. What happens is poor people or people who live in housing projects may not have driver's license, but they may have federal IDs based on living in government housing, right? They don't count. So what do? They closed polling places in poor areas, predominantly minority areas. So there's just been this constant movement of seeking to take away the fundamental right to vote as a citizen from particular groups of citizens. And we got two generations of people that are tired. Like every time there's something going on and y'all talk about this is the vote of our lives, you got to vote, but they don't see any changes. And why this is important is because I think that we forget that we have a government for the people, by the people, and that our task is to elect people who will honor our voices at the table. And sometimes what we do is it's the name that we've heard the most, or it's a name that we've seen, or it's a name that we're familiar with, but we don't know what they stand for. And so one of the things I wanted to do is to really kind of talk about what are the ways in which we as educated women, because I can't imagine if reading was a challenge, if English wasn't my first language, if there was some type of disability that I had, how to navigate these waters right now in order, number one, to register to vote, to think about getting to the polling place. But the other thing is, who are all these people? Why is this important? And so elections are local, state, and federal. We hear about the federal all the time, but the ones that really govern your life every single day and make it either easier for you to live and be and have your being or not are your state and local elections. Who's on your city council? Who's the sheriff? Who's on your school board? And then how do we go about doing this? So I started scouring all these sites to kind of think through how to help people begin doing their homework in the best way that they can to be informed about their voting choices, about those candidates and what those candidates are standing for, so that they can make an informed decision, not being, touted by misinformation. We know that the majority of the misinformation that we've been receiving has been foreign operatives, particularly from Russia and China. That is a proven fact. You can go and you can look on the government website and they'll tell you that. And so it's like, oh, so what's this? So 3 things that we need to pay attention to before you even think about voting. Was there redistricting? And how did that impact where you vote and who and how you can vote? The other one is knowing what the cutoff for your registration is. So some states allow you to register day of and allow you to vote. Many states will not. Sometimes you have to have registered at least a month before the elections, 2 weeks before the elections. So it's really important to know what your specific state, what their rules or regulations are. Polling places have been changed and closed. The other thing that's happened is in the last couple of years, we had a census. Census dictates what happens when it comes to congressional leadership. So when that happens, new districts happen, other districts go away, redistricting happens every time that there's a census. So it's really important to pay attention to what's going on with that. There's a case right now before the Supreme Court on this very thing about Alabama and their redistricting and having 35% of their population be African American, and yet putting all of them in one district, which limits their ability to have voice and representation. So we'll see what the Supreme Court decides on that. And if they will give them the 2 districts that they're supposed to have, or if they will leave the map the way it is. For now, they're stuck with the map that they have, which means that all of the African-American voters are in this one district. And it limits their ability to have a broader voice, and to kind of have that ebb and flow of being able to push back in certain ways. So that's the information. We've been hearing all about the crazy stuff that goes on. And I didn't want to definitely we can get to some of the crazy, but what I wanted to do is kind of say, here's what it is. Here's what your rights are. Here's what the amendment says. Here's what the voting rights did. Here's what the Supreme Court did. And here are our challenges. In 2020, we had one of the most diverse, fair elections this country has ever seen, and young people came out in droves. The challenge is young people aren't seeing the return on their investment. And so they're bent out of shape and they're wrestling with, so I voted, but the people I voted for aren't doing anything for me, or they're not doing anything for us, or, what does this mean? And so I think it's a question that all of us ask. I think there are a number of people that sit in our seats as academics that do this kind of work on a regular basis, and they're watching what's going on and they're analyzing, they're putting out these stats. But I think what's really important is if we don't hold our elected officials accountable, they're not going to do the things that we think that they're supposed to. And so how do we begin doing that? And so, we talked about gerrymandering and we talked about like the redistricting. For people that are living in Texas that are listening to us, particularly students, Texas has a law that will not allow people to register to vote if they have a temporary address. So students, if you're on college campuses, they're not allowing you to register to vote with your address on campus. You might want to ask some questions about that. You might want to look in to see what's going on and how you can secure your right to vote, what address they'll allow you to use, where you need to go in order to vote. You may not be able to vote on your college campus or in your town unless you've made that your permanent residence and address. So that's just an insight that as I've been digging and learning and trying to figure out, how to talk about some things, that these are things that students need to pay attention to, because, this is not tomorrow's generation. These are our people now. And if we can't encourage them to vote, how do we then encourage them to hold office? And this is the next step. So thoughts on all the junk I've just thrown out.
So thank you for sharing all that. It's so interesting. I remember hearing something about the changes to our voting laws back in 2013 and the impact, but I think that it didn't really show up in my periphery. Like I didn't really realize what was going on until the 2016 elections and the 2020 elections, which were really Interesting.
Okay.
Uh-huh. One of the things that Sebastian and I actually talk about quite often is what you've described, is that apathy. Not because they don't care, but because they don't see anything change, right?
Right.
It's like Sebastian is somewhat of a cynic, you know, and
Mhm.
sometimes for me it's really challenging because I have this growth mindset, and so I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, but how can we overcome this? How can we do things different? And he's like, what's the point? He's like, I don't want kids. I don't want to bring kids into this world. I don't, you know, like I hear the things he's saying and it's frustrating, but I understand. And some of what you're sharing aligns with that. It's this idea of we're doing the work, we're getting out there, we're voting, we're registering, we're reading, like he's reading the materials and things like that. But what's the point?
Right. Well,
Like,
and the other thing is when you think about where our Senate is in the split, and I put my head down in shame because of this, but they're not able to advance things in the cinema because you got two crazy people. And for better or for worse, they are not working on behalf of their constituents. They're working on behalf of the people who have contributed the most to their campaign. And that's Manchin and Sinema. And so, a lot of good legislation that they seek to get through gets gutted to the point where it's like, what did we just pass in order to get them to vote? And so if we want to see this movement, those are two people that definitely need to go. And we need to see the Senate move. But we also have to ask some questions about why the Democrat messaging is so poor. Like,
absolutely.
you're
Well, and that's one of the things that you and I have talked about at length, right? Is this idea that it reminds me very much of the whole Microsoft Apple competition, where Apple competes against itself, but Microsoft competes against Apple.
right.
Right. And so it's this idea of, and this is a conversation in my household as well. It's what Democrats are never very clear on what we're fighting for. We're really clear on what we're fighting against, and it's usually the Republicans.
Right.
But never clear on what we're like, what we're championing, what it is we want. And then we don't have a clear vision. We don't have clear goals. We don't have that long-term mentality. I mean, when you stop and think about how we ended up where we are with such a divisive approach to our politics, this was a long con. I mean, this was a long
50 years in the making. 50 plus years in the making. This has been the challenge since the 1964, 1963, 1964, and 1965 sweeping legislation that shifted the atmosphere. And I think that we somehow thought we had arrived. I also think that after President Obama's election, we thought we were in a post-racial space, and we weren't. I think that he had some missed opportunities when he had the Senate and the House in his court. And, this whole idea of wanting to work across the aisles with people who don't want to work with you. Like, how many times do we have to say this? We tell kids this on a regular basis. If they don't want to play with you, don't ask them to play, right? What we have right now is a fundamental challenge to, number one, how we define humanity, who we see, and how we're going to care for them at that level. So I like to say to young people that I'm encountering, if you really want to know what's on the ballot, clean air, your ability to breathe clean air is on the ballot. Now, it may not be listed on the ballot, but people who believe that global warming is a reality, they're there. Those that don't, and who believe that fossil fuels is the only way to go, they're on the ballot. Know that. Your right to choose who you love, how to love, what you do behind closed doors, it's on the ballot. I mean, we've already seen Roe v. Wade, but nobody pays attention to the deeper implications of your ability to have privacy is wrapped up in this particular thing as well. And so, it's all of those things. And it's like, as women, they want to take us back to the 18th century. Like, this is on the ballot, so the right to public education is on the ballot, because this movement to privatize education means that our tax dollars will be paying for our children not to get the education that they deserve. You'll have to pay extra money to go that private route, but they'll be taking our public money and putting it in private spaces. That's on the ballot. What are those things that are going on in your state that are important to you?
Right. Well, and that's the thing. It's everyone pays attention to the knowns, right? What's obvious, what's being discussed, the dog whistles, right? Everyone's aware of that. But what you don't hear, what you don't pay attention to is what are the things they're not saying, but they're supporting? What are the things that aren't front and center, but are being supported through other measures, or, who are lobbying it? The fact that we have such a huge lobbying arm within in our political system.
Companies that are able to buy politicians I think that we've got to take that money out of our electoral process. We also need to get rid of the electoral college, and we need to get rid of the filibuster, because it is not codified in law. It's just a practice that they've used, but it is not something that is necessary or even supposed to be there. Again, this is part of that dark history that we don't talk about. And the fairy tale that we want to tell is, the indigenous Native Americans just were so excited when, these Europeans came and decided to, take everything. They had a great turkey meal, and then they moved so that they could build up the land. I mean, this is the fairy tale that we tell. And again, this is on the ballot. What's going in your school? What's going on in your school, what they're teaching, what they're able to teach, what they're teaching about your children, about your history. Who wants to sit in a classroom where no matter what your people have done to help build this nation up, you've been completely erased, or the story has been so distorted that you're like, oh, did it really happen like that? We don't teach civics, so our children aren't excited about what's going on in the political arena. They don't know what's going on. They don't know that we have 3 co-equal branches of government. They don't always operate that way, but we do have them. They don't understand how we choose our representation, and that our state governments mirror what's going on in the federal government. We're just not teaching that in ways that I think are helpful. And I think this is the reason why people get really bent out of shape, is because, number one, we don't know. And then when we do know, it's because the house is on fire. And then, we're trying to put the fire out and trying to get people okay. But I've also been really concerned about the ways in which, if I read that 15th Amendment, that space of servitude, that means if you've been in jail, you should have your rights restored. And we know what that's looked like in Florida and many other places. If I've served my time, why can't I vote? And so those are things that, people are asking about and wanting to know. There are a lot of anti-voter bills that are in effect across the South. And the question is, what do we do? How do we do it? And now is not the time to give up. Now is the time to fight even more. And I think because there are so many things at stake, right? If we don't shift what's going on, we will literally hand minority rule down to the next 4 generations of people in this country, where we have something that looks like apartheid South Africa. I mean, that's the demographic, and that's the way it's going to look. So you're going to have all these beautiful Black and brown people, and they're not going to have any say in what goes on in their life.
A representation, right?
Yeah.
I have a question from an outsider. You mentioned
Yes.
about the electoral colleges that, they should review it, etc. And I am also interested in the way the the parties are shaped in the US, in which you have two major parties. What does, and these basically shape the power dynamics. So who is in
Yeah.
power will
Yeah.
try to do something while the other will try to block, so they can't do much, so they can change the party for the next, election. And this goes on a vicious cycle or something like that. This is at least my perspective
Yes.
from an outsider. Not to say that when you have two narrowed views, you are not really representing different perspectives as well. It's very hard to put that in context. So I would like to know your perspective as an American about the way this power dynamics is shaped in the US, and what are some, advice you give for people to, try to make a better decision, when they are voting.
Okay. So, the two-party system is problematic because it, we don't fall in as well into those two kind of progressive or liberal and conservative categories. I mean, there are these levels. We do have some independents, but what happens when you have a two-party dominant space is the independents just take votes away from the space that you really need to concentrate your votes if you're trying to shift things. So that's the first thing. So yeah, we probably do need to have multiple parties. That's just not how we were set up, Democrat and Republican. So, I mean, if you look at them on the surface, just in language, and you don't add in the conversation and all the stuff that we've heard recently, they look somewhat similar. The bigger challenge is that traditionally the Republican Party has been about small government and limited government involvement in things. Definitely states' rights, which means that the states' rights supersede anything else, and the federal government cannot get involved themselves in what's going on unless they're invited to. And then they've been about money, not big governmental spending, less spending when it comes to social concerns around caring for folks. You find people that have more means, and as traditionally, now right now it's just an insane mess, and I don't even know how to describe that other than an insane mess. But and the Democrats have been more open to the government being more involved and being involved in the social programming and this broader kind of what you see is like what we call a working class or blue collar class group of people. These are the folks that are doing the work, that are not necessarily business owners and stuff. So that kind of, I mean, this is a simplified way of thinking about it. It's a little more complex than that, but that's kind of the thing. And what happened was the parties kind of flipped. So, they used to be on opposite ends of the spectrum, and now they've kind of shifted and they're on different ones. So now what we have is, and the way in people which people describe it is the Democrats are more progressive, more about, they call them the tree hugging people, those kinds of things. And the Republicans are really about business and all those kinds of things. Now, when you begin looking at how they vote on things and what they focus on, they're more about people who are in power than they are about the general populace, and that's just the reality. So, for instance, if you're talking about like healthcare, access to those kinds of things, the Democrats tend to be the ones that are willing to want to fund that and fight for that. The Republicans are not. So those are the kind of broad spectrum things. I don't want to get into the nitpicky stuff. That'll take us on a longer ride. We talk about the Electoral College. It's the way in which our votes get cast. So we all vote, but each state has a set number of electoral votes that they have. That then the Electoral College, and you have a group in each state that does this, they count the votes. And then the way in which the election is certified, those people from the state bring those votes to Washington, and those are like codified and counted based on each state. Now, the challenge with that was when it was created so that the people who lost the war had a little more leeway and sway in being able to run and control things. And so what happens is you can win the popular vote and still lose the election because of the Electoral College. And so in many ways, this is what's happened the last couple of elections we've had. We've had a couple of presidents, both Republicans, who lost the popular vote by millions of votes, but won the Electoral College and thus became the president. And so did we really reflect the will of the people, or did we reflect the will of an archaic system that doesn't fairly represent the voices of the people if we're not taking the popular vote? So that's one of the things that we struggle with. Again, an oversimplified explanation to this. I'm not a political scientist. I'm just a person that's concerned about the country that I live in and wanting to make sure people's voices are heard, but that we care for folks. As you begin looking at what's going on in those contentious spaces, Georgia, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, those are those places. Number one, they hold a lot of the Electoral College votes. And then number two, these are the places that are part of what we have traditionally talked about as, the South and Southern strategy. And that would be people who were part of that space where we had the North and the South in the Civil War, and we were fighting over the issue of slavery and those kinds of things. That stuff hasn't gone away. It's just taken on a different form, and they put a suit on. That's it. And so we're still fighting those kinds of things. But when you start thinking about the fact that in Georgia, if you give somebody a drink of water in line, you could be prosecuted for giving somebody a drink of water standing in line to cast their vote. They now can, as a citizen in Georgia, you can literally challenge somebody's right to vote by challenging whether they are actually registered to vote or have the right to register to vote. These are things that are really going on. And when we live in other spaces and we don't know what's going on, we often don't recognize how when this happens in one state, it opens the door for it to happen in another state, and it opens the door to happen in another state. So literally in 2021, after the runoff elections in Georgia, these are the things that they started kind of doing to dissuade voters from, and particularly Black and Brown voters from voting. So there are a couple of websites that I want to offer up for people to kind of think through, take a look at. So vote411.org/ballot allows you to put in your zip code and look at the ballot and what's on it in each state, kind of go through. Some of them actually have links to candidates' websites that they have them tell you how they voted on certain things if they're incumbent. And they'll often show you where the debates have been. Ballotpedia.org also is another place where you can, again, look at the ballot, see what's on it, see what issues are on it by state. And you can look at local races, state races, both. Voterpal.org is a space where you can go and vote, where you can go and register to vote. VotoLatino.org, so it's VOTOLATINO.org, is a nonprofit group that's really been working within the Latinx community, because another group of people who are often silenced and kind of pigeonholed into certain ways and ways of being with voting are Latinos. So there's a lot of good information on there for people to really begin kind of looking at what the issues are, where those contentious spaces are. And then if you really want to know more about like the whole Voting Rights Act and what's going on with voting and why it's such a challenge, One Person, No Vote is a book by Carol Anderson. She's a professor at Emory University who talks about this extensively. The right to vote, why it's important, why it's being challenged, and what we must do in order to make sure that every citizen has a right to vote. And then if you really kind of want to pay attention to the contentious stuff that's going on, Reese Colbert's Long and Short of It Guide to the 2022 midterm elections, The Radical Republicans, is one that looks at the spaces like Georgia and Florida and I think North Carolina, but those big elections where it'll either shift the state from being red to blue or moving it from purple to blue or purple to red, and really like trying to make sure that people have the information that they need on how these people have voted, the laws that they put into action, the things that they're for, things that they're against, and then the ways in which you can weigh your options by having that information. So thoughts? I know there's a lot of information. Like I feel like it's just been rapid fire.
No, I mean, this is all great information, and I think it's very appropriate given where we're at and, the fact that our elections are right around the corner. Sometimes it's just so overwhelming.
Yes.
The fact that it's a basic right of American citizens, right? And I say that with a smile and a smirk, because that's at the heart of who we are as a country. And yet all of these obstacles, all of these challenges, and what's the word I'm looking for? It's subversive the way things are done to try to limit people of color.
Yeah, it is. And that's the scary part about it, right? When you think about the fact that, the preamble to the Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense. We say these things and we want people to be able to then enjoy this ability to the pursuit, of happiness. And then we stand in the way of certain people being able to do that. And again, I always ask the question, so if this is what you believe, then why is it not the same for these folks over here, whether English is their first language or not? They live here, they work here, you take their tax dollars like you take mine. What's the problem, right? And literally what the Electoral College basically says is y'all not smart enough to make that decision for yourselves. And so now they're wanting to say that if somehow at the local level, legislatively, if they disagree with the way the popular vote went, that they should be able to change that. Like that's literally another thing that's coming down the pike when you think about voting. And so I just want to encourage people to not give up. There are too many people from, the women's suffrage to African Americans who fought and lost life in order for people to actually have full citizenship and be able to enjoy what that means. And we are not there yet. We are not there as African Americans and Black people. We're not there as Mexican Americans, Latino, Latinx folks, AIP people, Black and brown folks in this country. Even though we are slowly becoming the majority, our humanity has not been valued by the dominant culture. And I think a lot of it is wrapped up, again, in the narrative that's been anchored about who we say we are and how we got to be where we are. And I think it's really important for us to tell the right story. We have some shady beginnings. And yet, even with those shady beginnings, at each juncture, people have been fighting to force us to live into the things that we espouse, those things in the Constitution about all of us being created equal and all having the right to this. We've been pushing the envelope and pushing to say, if this is what you're going to say and you will put it in paper, you need to live into this. And that means making sure that all of us have a voice at the table. But that also means, and I realize people are just living life. Folks are struggling. They trying to keep a roof over their head and clothes on their back and food on the table. They're trying to figure out how they're going to vote. Like, if voting is literally our right, then it should be a federal holiday. And people should not have to choose whether they go to work or not in order to vote. They shouldn't have to put their lives on the line like we did during COVID, like the height of COVID. COVID hasn't gone anywhere, so I don't want people thinking I said that. Make it easy for people to vote. But, at some point during the last election, they didn't even want to count the servicemen and women who are fighting for this country, their mail-in ballots. And so hypocrisy is at the heart of this as well. So I think the soul of who America says it is and who America can be is on this ballot. And if nothing else, I know Ida's not here, but we want to be able to secure a much better future in a space where all of our children and all the people that live here have opportunity to have better life, clean water, access to healthcare, access to good education, living wages for the work that they do. And it's not an impossibility. But the other thing that this voting thing keeps bringing up is when people hoard resources and then they make the people that are most vulnerable fight amongst themselves in order to secure resources. Because this is what this is.
Right. Well, and, if we're fighting against each other, then we lose sight of where those resources are really ending up, right? If we're fighting for this little bit of resource here, but it's being hoarded and stacked and secured somewhere else, we don't pay attention to that because we're too busy fighting amongst each other. And I think it's saddening. It's saddening because for those of us that have been socialized in this country, we're on the borderline of being brainwashed into the greatness of what is the United States, right?
Right. It's the ideal versus the reality.
Right. But then we should be striving for that ideal. And that's, I think, where we don't even agree what that ideal is anymore. And so we lose sight of that vision. We lose sight of that greatness, Yes. And it's possible if we could all just look out for the greater good.
Right.
But then who gets to determine the greater good? And that's the $1 million question, right? Do we, as our own, get to decide, or does somebody else get to decide? And who are they deciding for?
Yeah. No other place can you work, not do your job and keep it, but you can in the government. you can as elected officials. That's the sad part about it. Again, it's because I think people don't know people's names. They don't know what's going on. They haven't been paying attention because they just been living life. But I think that, if nothing else, we need to vote and vote like our lives depend on it, because it does, they do. We want to see the Voting Rights Act that John Lewis was striving to get through before he died, go through, which will codify all people's right to vote in this country, without us having to worry about the Supreme Court gutting parts of it or whatever, or states being able to say, well, we're going to close this polling place and we're going to redraw the map this way, and all those kinds of things. And then we need to talk about the expansion of the court, because it's a hot mess, right? And what happens is the way the courts are decided now, they really get anchored in one party or another party based on who's able to offer up names for the courts, right? The president does that, whatever president it is, whatever the ideology is, whatever, so I think we've got to expand the court so we at least have a little bit of breathing room, have more opportunity. We need to be clear about not taking a president's right away from him or her. So, speak those things that may not be as if they are, so that they can be, so that they also are able to do the things that they've been, tasked with doing. I think that we need to have systems of accountability that actually work. There needs to be an ethical space and an ethical guideline for the courts. These are all things that we need to think about being on the ballot when we're voting for folks who will fight for these things for us. Races to pay attention to are in Ohio, Texas, North Carolina, and Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Those are some of the bigger contentious ones. We've all been seeing the Georgia stuff between, the Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker. In my mind, there is not a comparison at all. But we also know that power is what's on the ballot, not someone's ability to govern or their ability to read or even speak clearly, because that's not, this is a power dynamic that it is. And so do we want someone who may have a traumatic brain injury that's very obvious, in a space to make decisions, knowing that it won't be him making the decisions, but the money behind it? So that's a question. The Ohio one, I hate to say the lesser of the two evils, but lesser of the two evils. We've got governorships in a couple of places that are up. So there are Senate and House seats open all over the place on both sides of the aisle. And again, it's, what do we want to see for the next generation? This is not just about us now. It's what are we leaving for the next generation? Are we going to leave them a planet that's on fire without clean air and clean water, and the inability to make good decisions for themselves and to have a role in how their lives play out? I think are all the things that are really important for us to be talking about. And so my hope, my prayer for folks is that they silence the noise and do their own homework. You got to look at multiple sources of information. Don't keep going back to the same source. Look at some international spaces, because the international space will tell you what we won't tell you. I offer up, I used to read the Jerusalem Times just to kind of see what they were saying about what was going on in the United States. Sometimes it's important to listen to the BBC. The Financial Times actually tells the story about the money, and they're not going to be funny about the money because the money makes the world go round. So I think it's just really important for us to be well-informed citizens and not to be so bogged down by the drudgery of our lives sometimes and just being overwhelmed that we forget that part of living in this space is doing our part and being informed citizens and casting our vote.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, so Ellen, I know this is outside of the realm. I know Brazil's system is a little bit different. And I'm sure you're watching what's going on there.
No, but it's good to learn a little bit more every time I talked about that a lot last year. About I learned a lot about the United States system during the last couple of years when I started after I started to study at Pepperdine. And I can draw some parallels. That's why I asked that question, because there are some problems that might be in the structure and the power dynamics, in my opinion, but also, you know, we have a problem of values, because it's kind of, okay, this is my team, so I was born in this team and I will stay with this team forever, or something like that. And we are not talking about, you know, a football game team, but the future of your country, the future of a society, the future of, you know. So I appreciate when you said, okay, look at, you know, other lenses, you know, outside the US, look at, you know, other resources. Try to figure out what is going on, try to bring more facts, etc., so people can make more informed decision instead of something that, you know, just happened to them, to be born in this way and, you know, keep with these lenses and etc. So yeah, I appreciate the emphasis you brought into that.
I thank you all for this conversation. We would have loved to have more voices, yet this just wasn't able to. But I hope that I've given good information for people to go and search. Don't take my word for anything. Go and look at the information that's out there. It's readily available. Read, ask questions, go to town halls if you can, watch what they're putting on when it comes to the many different conversations that'll go on. There'll be town halls, there'll be debates. Look at the websites. Most candidates have a website of some sort. Look at what they're saying. See if it aligns with your values. Don't take my word for anything. Always do your own homework. I know what's important, and I know that human beings are important, and the right for every human being to be able to make a decision about their life and not have somebody else do it is really important to me. And I don't care whether you're Democrat or Republican or independent. What I know is if you claim to love this country, and you claim to love and agree with what we say we value, then everyone's right to vote matters. Everyone's voice matters. And that should be what we're fighting for, no matter whether I agree with your politic or not.
Very well said. Thank you, Sharletta, for that closing remark. And thank you for sharing everything. I mean, it was really enlightening. Even as someone that votes, you know, just all of these reminders are good to hear. And I know that you and I have had multiple conversations leading up to this, and we'll continue having conversations as the elections kind of unfurl and we see how things are going. I share the concern you have about humanity. I share the concern about how politics are shaped within our country, and we have the potential for so much more. So let's continue the dialogue. Let's continue the conversation, and we will be back next time.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you.